The poison was already killing him when Elise Winterbourne drove her car through the iron gates of Gravesend Manor. She had not been invited. She had not been announced. She had been dragged here against her will by a vampire named Seraphine, who smelled of old copper and looked at her the way predators look at useful things they plan to discard. He had appeared at her clinic 3 hours ago, overturned her examination table, shattered the overhead light, and told her in a voice like grinding stone that she would come with him, or he would burn the building to its foundation, with her patients still inside. Elise had come. She was a healer. That was not a metaphor, and it was not a vague professional title. She had graduated at the top of her class from Johns Hopkins, completed her residency in trauma surgery, and then spent the last 4 years operating a small private clinic in the lower district of a city that had no official name on any vampire charter, but was known among the blood courts as the Threshold. It was the seam between the human world and the immortal one, a grey stretch of streets and old brick buildings where vampires walked freely after dark, and humans mostly pretended not to notice. Elise had noticed. She had also begun treating them. Not many doctors would. The blood laws were complex, the courts were dangerous, and the politics of immortal society had a habit of getting humans killed when they wandered too close to old disputes. But people were suffering in the Threshold, human and vampire alike, and Elise Winterbourne had not spent 8 years in medical training to look the other way, so she knew what a vampire dying of poison looked like. She had seen it once before. A young woman of the lesser court who had been brought to her clinic wrapped in black silk and barely breathing, and she had saved her with careful chemistry and a terrifying amount of focused work. But that had been a minor courtier. The man laid out on the long mahogany table in the heart of Gravesend Manor was not a minor courtier. Constantin Gravesend, Lord of the Eastern Blood Court, ruler of 7 ancient bloodlines, was the most powerful vampire in the Northern Hemisphere, and he was dying. He did not look like a man who could die, even in extremis. Sprawled across that table with his white shirt torn open and his silver-white hair spread loose across the dark wood, he was magnificent. His skin was the color of old ivory, perfectly pale, the kind of pallor that came not from illness but from centuries of existing beneath stone and starlight. His jaw was sharp, his cheekbones severe, and even unconscious there was something imperious in the set of his features. Something that said he had never once lowered his head to anyone, but the black veins spreading outward from a wound just below his left collarbone were undeniable. Elise set her medical bag on the nearest surface, stripped off her jacket, and turned to face the room full of vampires who were staring at her like she was either a miracle or a meal. There were at least 20 of them. Some were in modern clothing, sleek suits and silk blouses, the kind of wardrobe that said money and power and do not make the mistake of thinking we are ordinary. Others wore older things, robes of deep burgundy and black, the sort of formal court dress she had only seen in photographs taken in the 19th century. Their eyes ranged in color from deep amber to near violet, to a red so dark it was almost black, and every single one of them was watching her with that particular brand of still-focused attention that vampires used when they were deciding whether something was a threat. She refused to flinch. "Someone tell me what he was poisoned with," she said, pulling on gloves with the practiced snap of someone who had done it 10,000 times. "Right now, I need the compound name, the delivery method, and when it happened." Silence. Then a woman stepped forward from the cluster near the fireplace. She was tall, white-haired like all of them, with eyes the color of old amber, and a gown of deep green that made her look like something painted into the wall of a cathedral. Her face was beautiful and cold, and carrying an expression that told Elise she would very much prefer to be dismissing her. "You will address the court with appropriate deference, human," the woman said. Her accent was old European, the kind that did not belong to any specific country because it predated most of them. "You stand in the presence of the Eastern Blood Court. You were summoned as a tool. You will speak when spoken to." Elise looked at her for exactly 2 seconds. Then she looked back at Constantin. "He has approximately 40 minutes, she said flatly. "Maybe less, given the progression of those veins. You can have your etiquette lesson or you can have your lord alive. Pick one." The silence that followed was so absolute she could hear the candles burning. Then a man near the door, younger looking than most of them, with dark violet eyes and the look of someone perpetually caught between loyalty and terror, said quickly, "Ashenvale compound, derived from nightshade and silver particulate, suspended in a modified blood anticoagulant. It was delivered via a blade at the conclave 3 hours ago. We do not know which of the lesser houses supplied the weapon." Elise was already moving. "Betrayal from the inside. Wonderful. Does this manor have a proper surgery, or am I working on a dining table?" "There is a medical suite on the lower level," the young vampire said. He had appeared at her elbow without making a sound, which she was absolutely going to process later. "I am Théodan. I serve Lord Gravesend directly. I brought you here because you saved Mira of the Linden Court last autumn, and she swore you were the only human healer who understood our physiologies." "Mira was very kind to say so," Elise said, already moving toward the door he indicated. "I'm going to need silver chelation agents, activated charcoal if you have it. A defibrillator that I suspect you don't have but I carry one, and someone who can carry him without jostling that wound." "I will carry him," said a voice from the corner of the room. It was not a loud voice, it was not raised, but it carried the way voices carry in old stone spaces, filling every corner without apparent effort, and the entire room shifted subtly at the sound of it. The way a forest shifts when something large moves through it. Elise turned. The man who had spoken was standing in the shadows near the far wall, and at first she had simply missed him, which seemed impossible given how he looked. He was tall, broader through the shoulder than most of the vampires in the room, dressed in black that looked expensive and old in equal measure. His hair was silver white like theirs, but longer, pulled back at the base of his neck with a plain cord, and his eyes, when they met hers, were the deep particular shade of grey that made her think of ice over deep water. He was not Constantin. Constantin was still lying on the table. This was someone else. Someone older, she thought, though that made no rational sense, because she had no way to measure vampire age by sight. She just felt it, the same way you feel the age of a very old tree or a very old building, something in the weight and stillness of him. "Who are you?" she asked. "Lucavian," he said simply. "I am Constantin's second." "Then please carry him carefully and follow me, Lucavian." He did not move immediately. He looked at her for a moment with those ice-grey eyes, and she had the unsettling feeling of being measured against some internal standard she could not see. Then he crossed the room, lifted Constantin from the table with a gentleness that seemed almost incongruous in someone his size, and followed her through the door. The medical suite was better than she had expected. Someone had clearly thought about this, had anticipated the possibility of catastrophic injury, and prepared accordingly, which told her something about the court's leadership, even before she had met its lord conscious. There was a proper examination bed, overhead lighting that worked on a different circuit from the manor's main power, a refrigerated cabinet stocked with blood bags, and a supply of medical equipment that was partially standard and partially modified in ways she recognized from her own clinical work. She worked for 3 hours. The Ashenvale compound was sophisticated, nastier than anything she had encountered before. Specifically engineered to defeat vampire physiology by using silver to block their accelerated cellular repair, while the nightshade disrupted the nervous system's response to pain signals. Left untreated, it would have killed Constantin within the hour. Treated carelessly, it might still kill him, because the chelation process had to be precise, or the silver would release all at once into his bloodstream instead of gradually, and that would stop his heart just as effectively as poison. Elise did not work carelessly. She spoke aloud as she worked, partly out of habit, partly because she had discovered early in her career that narrating procedures helped her catch errors. Théodan stayed in the room, answering her questions when she had them, fetching what she needed from the cabinet, and watching her with an expression that she thought, in a less fraught moment, she might have identified as dawning respect. Lucavian stood against the wall and said nothing, but she was aware of him the way you are aware of a storm front, that peripheral knowledge of something large and charged just at the edge of your attention. At the 2-hour mark, Constantin's eyes opened. They were a color she had not been prepared for, not the amber or violet or dark red of the others. His eyes were the deep, rich gold of autumn just before it collapses into winter, extraordinary and intent, and they focused on her face with a precision that told her he was not as disoriented as she would have expected. "You are not Seraphine," he said. His voice was rough from whatever the poison had done to his throat, but even rough it was remarkable, low and resonant with the faint trace of an accent she could not quite place. "No," she said without looking away from her work. "Seraphine collected me. I am Elise Winterbourne. I am your healer. Please do not try to sit up." A pause. "You are human, extraordinarily so. Try not to move your left arm." Another pause, longer this time. She glanced up and found him watching her with an expression she could not decode, something between surprise and something more complicated. "You saved my life," he said. It was not a question. "I'm still saving your life," she corrected. "Ask me again in about 40 minutes. Something shifted in his expression then. It was not a smile, not quite, but it had the ghost of one in it, some private acknowledgement of something she could not see. He turned his head slightly toward where Lucavian stood against the wall, and she saw something pass between them without words, the communication of people who have known each other long enough that language is redundant. "Leave us," Constantin said. Lucavian did not argue. He inclined his head and left, and Theoden followed him. And suddenly the room was quiet, and it was only Elise and the vampire lord, and the steady sound of medical equipment, and the extraordinary intimacy of emergency medicine, which had always struck her as one of the most honest forms of human contact. The moment when the armor everyone wore was simply irrelevant because what mattered was survival. "You should know," Constantin said, his voice lower now, "that bringing a human into the court unsanctioned carries consequences under the blood law." "I know," Elise said. "I read the charter 3 years ago. Seraphine will claim necessity, and the court can dispute it, and there will be a formal adjudication. I know how it works." His silence this time had a different quality. "You read the Blood Court Charter. I treat vampire patients. It seemed prudent to understand the legal framework I was operating within. Most humans in the threshold do not make that effort. Most humans in the threshold are not surgeons with a professional obligation to understand their patients," she said. She checked the chelation rate, adjusted the drip slightly, watched the black veining in his chest, and counted the seconds until she saw it begin, very slowly, to recede. "The poison is clearing. Your healing mechanisms are beginning to reactivate. You should feel less pressure in your chest within the next 20 minutes. He was quiet for a moment. Then, with a careful deliberateness that told her he was choosing his words with some precision, he said, "I owe you a debt." "You owe me nothing," she said. "I am a healer. This is what I do." "The Blood Court does not recognize unpaid debts," he said, "especially not debts of life. The ancient vow of the Gravesend line is old law, Elise Winterbourne, and it requires that a life saved is a life owed. I will not insult you by ignoring it." She looked at him then, really looked at him, and found him looking back with those extraordinary golden eyes, steady and direct and carrying the particular weight of someone who meant exactly what they said. "All right," she said after a moment. "Then we will discuss it when you are not attached to 3 different medical devices." That almost smile again. Agreed. He was not fully recovered when the court convened. Elise knew that, and she was fairly certain at least some members of the court knew it too. But a blood court convening was not something that could be postponed simply because its lord had nearly been murdered. Apparently, it operated on its own timeline, governed by laws old enough to predate the city they were hidden beneath. And those laws said that a court challenge required immediate adjudication, because that was what this was. Elise stood in the center of what the court called the sanctum, which occupied the entire underground level of Gravesend Manor, and was the most impressive room she had ever been in, including the operating theatres at Johns Hopkins. The walls were dark stone dressed with centuries of history, with tapestries and weapons and framed documents in languages she half recognized, and the ceiling was vaulted and impossibly high and lit by what appeared to be genuine candlelight, amplified through some optical system she could not immediately identify. The court was arranged in a semicircle facing the central floor. 23 vampires in formal court dress watching her with the collective attention of people who had spent centuries sharpening their judgment on harder cases than this. Constantin stood at the center of the semicircle, and even though she knew exactly how pale and strained he looked, Beneath his restored, formal bearing, he looked like power. He stood straight, his silver-white hair loose around his shoulders now, instead of pulled back, wearing a jacket of deep charcoal that bore no decoration because it did not need any, and his golden eyes swept the assembled court with the calm authority of someone who had never once doubted his right to be there. The woman in green, whose name Elise had learned was Morvan, stood 3 places to Constantin's left and was watching Elise with a cool, particular contempt that made her feel like something tracked in from outside. The human healer Elise Winterbourne was brought into the Eastern Court without formal sanction, Morvan said, her voice carrying the same old-world precision as before. She is unregistered with the Blood Court Registry. She holds no formal relationship with any recognized bloodline. Under Section 14 of the ancient charter, she is an outsider, and her presence in the sanctum is itself a violation of blood law. Her presence in this sanctum saved the lord of this court, Theodan said from his place at the edge of the room, his voice tight with barely controlled emotion. Without her intervention, Lord Gravesend would have died before our own court physicians reached him. Your own court physicians, Morvan said, turning that cool amber gaze on Theodan with the precision of a scalpel, were delayed because someone ensured they received false routing instructions during the conclave. Someone wanted the Lord without medical aid, which is a matter for the tribunal to address separately. Her gaze returned to Elise. None of that changes the legal standing of this human's presence in our court. Elise had known this moment was coming. She had spent the 4 hours between Constantin's stabilization and this gathering preparing for it, turning over the possibilities in her mind with the same methodical focus she brought to a complicated diagnosis. She was not afraid, exactly. She was the kind of alert that fear produces when you have trained it into something more useful. She was aware of Constantin watching her. She did not look at him. I understand the court's position, she said, and her voice came out steadier than she had expected. I understand that the blood law treats my presence here as a violation, and I am not here to argue against the law as it exists. I am here because Seraphin brought me here under coercion, and I treated a patient because that is my profession and my obligation, and I would do it again under identical circumstances. If the court requires a formal sanction for my presence here retroactively, I am prepared to hear the conditions. Morvan's expression did not change. The condition is simple. An unsanctioned outsider brought into the inner court is remanded to the registry process or expelled from the threshold permanently. There is no third option under the charter. The word permanent settled into the silence of the room like a stone into water. The threshold was Elise's home. Her clinic was there, her patients were there, the human ones and the vampire ones, all the people in the grey between the two worlds who had come to depend on her. Permanent expulsion meant leaving them, meant dismantling 8 years of work, meant abandoning a space she had built with her own effort and refusal to be frightened away. She kept her face still, then Constantin spoke. The charter, he said, and his voice was very quiet, also contains a provision that Morvan has chosen not to cite. Section 7, Clause 3. The ancient vow of life debt. Morvan turned to look at him. Something shifted in her expression very briefly, something that looked like calculation. The life debt provision applies to blood court members, she said. It applies to any individual acknowledged by the lord of the court, Constantin said. Those are the exact words, any individual. The distinction of blood court membership was added by Morvan's predecessor on the tribunal in the 9th revision, which has never been formally ratified by a full court assembly. The original charter language stands. His golden eyes moved to Elise, and there was something in them now that she felt in her sternum. I acknowledge Elise Winterbourne as a life debt holder of the Gravesend court. Her presence in the sanctum is therefore not a violation but a right. The silence that followed was so charged it had texture. Lucavian, from his position at the wall, said nothing, but Elise saw the very slight inclination of his head, the ghost of an approving nod. Morvan said softly, "You do understand what you are doing." "I understand precisely what I am doing," Constantin said. There was no heat in his voice. There did not need to be. "I am acknowledging a debt. I am honoring a vow older than this court, older than this city, older than most of the laws you are currently citing at me. And I am telling you, Morrivan, that if you wish to challenge the legal standing of an ancient vow in front of this full assembly, I will welcome that challenge, and I will answer it." Morrivan looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked away. The court found no charge. Afterward, when the sanctum had emptied of everyone but Tierdan and Lucavian, and 2 or 3 others who belonged to Constantin's direct household, Elise found herself standing in the center of that enormous room, feeling the particular exhaustion that comes after sustained adrenaline, the hollowness that settles in once the emergency is genuinely over. She heard footsteps and looked up, and Constantin was crossing the floor toward her. He moved carefully, still, compensating for the wound without showing it, but his bearing was unmistakably his own, that regal, unhurried quality that seemed to say the world would wait for him. "You held your ground well," he said, when he was close enough that she did not have to raise her voice to reply. "I told the truth," she said. "It's usually the most effective strategy." "In human courts," he said, with a slight inflection that was not quite amusement but was something adjacent to it. "In blood courts, truth is a tool like any other. You used it effectively." "Was Morrivan behind the poisoning?" she asked, because that had been the question sitting at the back of her mind since she first heard the word conclave. Constantin looked at her steadily. "That is a perceptive question." "It is the obvious question," she said. She knew the specific compound name before anyone had formally announced it. She cited the charter provisions that would have gotten rid of me before I could speak to you about what I had witnessed. And she has the most to gain from your death, given that the succession law of the blood court gives the tribunal chair a temporary governance role if the lord dies without a formal heir in place. The silence that followed was different from all the ones before it. It was the silence of someone who was not expected to be surprised and has been. "You have been in the threshold for 4 years, Constantin said slowly. "I have been paying attention for 4 years, she said. "There is a difference." He said nothing for a long moment, and she watched him process her, could almost see the reassessment happening behind those golden eyes. "Morrivan is on the tribunal," he said finally. "I cannot move against her without evidence that meets the court standard, which requires as choice either a witnessed account from a blood court member or a physical artifact of the crime. Suspicion, even well-reasoned suspicion, is not enough. Then we need to find the artifact," Elise said. "The blade that delivered the compound. If it was Ashenvale, it was made by someone with access to silver chemistry and nightshade extraction at a court level. That is not a common skill set. The maker left a signature in the compound. I could see the formulation pattern when I was analyzing it. If I can identify the maker, you have a thread." Constantin was quiet for a very long time, and the candlelight of the sanctum played across the planes of his face and made the silver of his hair look almost like it was moving. "You are willing to do this," he said. It was not quite a question. "Someone tried to kill you," she said. "Someone used the attempt as cover to try to get me expelled from my home. I take both of those things seriously." Something changed in his expression at that. Not the ghost smile she had seen in the medical suite, but something deeper. Something that had the quality of a door opening in a wall you had thought was solid. "Then I suggest," he said, "that you do not return to your clinic tonight. I would prefer you remain here, where my security extends to you. Until Morrivan's involvement is either confirmed or ruled out, you are a witness to my survival, which makes you a target." She thought about arguing. She thought about it for about 4 seconds, ran the logic, and concluded that he was right. "I will need my equipment if I am going to analyze the compound further," she said, "and I will need someone to contact my assistant and tell her to close the clinic for a few days. Both can be arranged." He paused. Elise. It was the first time he had used her name, just her name, without the formal addition of her surname. It landed differently than she expected. "Yes," she said. "Thank you," he said, "for my life." The words were simple, but the weight behind them was not. She could hear the depth of what it cost an immortal of his particular pride to say them. The ancient vow of his line rendered personal and immediate, and the honesty of it made her chest feel strange. "You are welcome," she said. "Try not to get stabbed at the next conclave." That almost smile broke open then, actually became a smile, and it transformed his face so completely that she lost her train of thought for a full 3 seconds, which she found deeply inconvenient. She slept in a guest suite that was nicer than anywhere she had ever stayed, in a bed with linen that probably had a thread count higher than her annual income, and she stared at the ceiling for a long time before sleeping, and told herself very firmly that she was here as a professional and a witness, and nothing else. The next 3 days were the most extraordinary of her life. She worked in the medical suite, piecing apart the Ashenville compound with the equipment Tierdan had retrieved from her clinic, along with changes of clothes, and bless him, her coffee maker. The chemistry was fascinating in the worst possible way. Someone had clearly spent a great deal of time and care on this formulation, and the specific combination of silver particulate sizing and nightshade derivative concentration was precise enough to be almost artistic. Artists had signatures. She found it on the second day, buried in the compound's stabilizing agent, a specific ratio of organic binding compound that she had seen once before, not in a laboratory result, but in a case study from the Blood Court's own medical archive, which Tierdan gave her access to without being asked and without apparent concerns about what she might find. The binding agent matched a formulation that had been developed and patented, in vampire court terms, by a Blood Court alchemist named Dressivane, who had been officially dismissed from the Eastern Court 18 months ago, following a dispute with Constantine's administration, and had subsequently been linked to the court of Morovan's primary ally, the Sylthane bloodline. It was not proof of Morovan's direct involvement, but it was a thread, exactly as she had said, and it led somewhere specific. She brought her findings to Constantine in the library, which occupied the entire east wing of the manor's upper floor, and smelled of leather and thyme, and something faintly floral that she thought might be some old botanical preservation technique for the books. He was sitting at a desk in the low lamplight, reading something that looked like it was written in Latin, and he looked up when she entered without apparent surprise, as though he had known she was coming. She laid out her analysis on the desk in front of him, the compound charts, the binding agent comparison, the chain of custody she had reconstructed from the archive records. He read through it in silence, which, with Constantin, she had learned meant focused attention and not dismissiveness. Dressivane, he said finally. He made the compound, she said. I am certain of that, to the degree that scientific certainty ever applies to forensic chemistry. Whether Morvan commissioned it directly, or whether it passed through intermediaries, I cannot tell you from the chemistry alone. But this gives you your physical artifact. It gives me the maker, he said. If Dressivane can be compelled to give testimony about the commission, it becomes a chain that leads somewhere actionable. He sat back, and she saw him working through it with the same focused precision she used in surgery, except that his instrument was authority and law instead of a scalpel. The tribunal cannot block a testimony summons if the evidence of the physical artifact is presented first. The charter is clear on that. Then present it, she said. He looked at her across the desk, and the lamplight made his golden eyes look impossibly warm, and she was very carefully not thinking about that. I will, he said. Tomorrow, tonight, I want to show you something. She blinked. What? He stood, and the movement had a fluid economy to it that she still was not quite used to, that quality all the vampires had of moving without wasted motion, but in him particularly resonant, because of his size and that particular self-possession. Come with me, he said, and it was not quite an order, not from someone who gave orders reflexively, but it had the confidence of someone who does not often ask twice. She went. He took her up through the manor, past the formal rooms and the sanctum entrance, through a door she had not noticed before that led to a staircase that wound upward through the stone until it opened onto the roof. The city spread below them in every direction, the threshold and beyond it the wider modern city, all light and movement and the hum of ordinary life, and above it the sky was very clear and very cold and absolutely crowded with stars. You can see this from up here, she said, and heard how flat and inadequate the words were, how entirely insufficient to describe what it looked like. I have stood on this roof for 200 years, Constantin said from beside her. On difficult nights. It helps to remember that there is something larger than the court. She turned to look at him and found him looking not at the city but at her, with that quality of attention that she had been carefully not thinking about for 3 days. You have been in the threshold for 4 years, he said again. The same words as before, but with a different weight now, as if he were still working on their meaning. You built something there. Something important. Somebody had to, she said. The people in the threshold needed medical care, and nobody was providing it. Why did you stay? After the first time a vampire patient came to you. Most humans would have been frightened enough to leave. She considered the question seriously, because he was asking it seriously. Because I was more interested than I was frightened, she said. I am a healer. What I find in my patients is always more compelling than what I fear about them. And because the threshold needed me to stay, and that has always been a more persuasive argument than my own comfort. He was quiet for a moment. Then, with careful deliberateness, he said, I want to extend a formal offer of court protection to you. Not just the life debt provision, which is personal and limited. A formal court endorsement that would register you as a sanctioned practitioner of the blood court territories. It would give you legal standing in any court negotiation, protection under the blood law from any vampiric threat, and the resources of this court to support your clinic. She stared at him. Why? Because you are extraordinary, he said simply, and the word extraordinary in his voice carried no flattery, no performance, just the plain directness of a conclusion reached through evidence. Because the threshold needs what you provide. Because Moravan will try again when the tribunal clears her, as it will even with the evidence we have unless the testimony chain holds, and I will not leave you without protection in that interval. And because, he paused, she waited. Because I would prefer to have a reason to see you again, he said. That does not require one of us to be dying. The stars were very bright above them, and the city hummed below them, and Elise Winterbourne stood on the roof of Gravesend Manor, and felt the very precise sensation of something she had been holding carefully at bay for 3 days step through the guard she had set against it. She made a decision. I accept, she said, on the condition that the court protection extends to my patients as well, human and vampire both. I will not take resources that help me if they compromise the people I serve. Agreed, he said, without hesitation. And I want it in writing, she said. Blood court charter format, properly witnessed. Naturally, he said, and that full smile appeared again, the one that transformed his face, and this time she let herself experience it without filing it away. I also want, she said, before she could reconsider it, to know more about you. Not the Lord of the Eastern Blood Court, you. The smile softened into something quieter and more real. That, he said, may take considerably longer than tonight. I have time, she said. The tribunal convened 4 days later, and it was nothing like the court assembly had been. It was tighter, more concentrated, more dangerous, in the way that small, closed spaces are dangerous when they contain people with conflicting interests and no escape route. There were 5 tribunal members. Moravan sat at the center. Lucavian, whom Elise had discovered was one of the most senior and unimpeachably impartial figures in the entire blood court system, sat to her right. The other 3 she had researched with Théodan's help, and she had a reasonable read on where their allegiances lay. Constantin stood at the floor of the tribunal chamber and presented the compound analysis with a precision and calm that she found, despite everything, genuinely impressive. He understood the chemistry well enough to have absorbed her findings completely and was presenting them as though he had done the analysis himself, which she chose to take as a compliment rather than an irritation, because it meant he had actually read everything she gave him. Moravan listened to all of it with that cold, amber gaze and no expression whatsoever. Then she said, the analysis is compelling, but the chain of custody remains theoretical. Dressavain's location is unknown. Without his testimony, you have a compound formulation that resembles his work but cannot be definitively attributed. His location, Théodan said, from the wall, has been identified. Moravan turned to look at him. He is in the Silthane territories, Théodan said, and his voice had a quality in it that Elise recognized as controlled anger. The careful management of something that wanted to be much louder. Specifically, in the secondary residence of the Silthane bloodline steward, a fact we confirmed last night through a tracing of the stabilizing compound's organic component. The component requires a specific plant extract that only grows in 3 locations in the hemisphere, one of which is the Silthane greenhouse complex. The silence in the tribunal chamber was the densest silence, Elise had yet experienced in this world. Lucavian turned to look at Morrivan with those ice-grey eyes and said nothing. He did not need to. Morrivan's expression had changed, finally. It was not fear exactly, but it was the calculation of someone who knows a trap has closed around them and is working out whether any of the exits they had prepared are still usable. They were not, because Elise had anticipated this. She had anticipated it because she had learned in 4 years of working in the threshold that the most dangerous moment in any court confrontation was when the court party realized there was no escape, and that moment usually produced one of two things: surrender or as escalation. Morrivan chose escalation. She did it by reaching into the fold of her court robe and producing a blade. And she was across the tribunal chamber, in the fraction of an end that Elise could not quite track before she cleared the distance, because she was a vampire moving at full speed, and human perception simply could not follow it. But Elise had positioned herself near the door, not at the center of the floor, and Constantin was between them. He caught Morrivan's wrist 1 inch from Elise's throat, and the crack of the hold was audible and decisive. And Morrivan went absolutely still in the way that prey goes still when it understands it is caught. "Do not," Constantin said, very quietly, "touch her." 3 words. But the weight behind them was enormous. The weight of what he was willing to do, the weight of what she meant to him, even though neither of them had said anything explicit, the weight of a protective instinct, so fundamental it had activated in the space of less than a second. Lucavian was already behind Morrivan. The 3 other tribunal members had stepped back with the uniform movement of people who know when something has concluded. "This is a blood law violation," Morrivan said, and she was still trying to sound imperious, but there was something cracked in it now. Attacking a tribunal member, drawing a blade against a court-protected individual in a formal proceeding, Lucavian said from behind her, "is the violation, Morrivan, by 3 separate provisions of the ancient charter, and it has been witnessed by a full tribunal." Morrivan said nothing after that. There was nothing to say. She was remanded to blood court custody, which Elise understood to mean something considerably more final than a human institution's version of the same phrase. Dressivane was summoned from the Silthane territories under the treaty provisions, testified within 48 hours under the ancient vow of testimony, and the chain from the blade to the commission was complete. The Silthane bloodline lost its court standing. 2 of their allied houses went with them in the restructuring that followed, which Lucavian supervised with the efficiency of someone who had done this before and found it tedious. The Eastern Blood Court's internal structure shifted in ways that would take years to fully settle, but the immediate danger was ended. Elise stood in the medical suite on the evening the tribunal concluded, packing away the last of her analysis equipment, and she was tired in a way that went deeper than physical, the bone-level exhaustion of sustained crisis resolved. She heard the door. Constantin leaned against the frame and watched her pack for a moment, and she did not turn around, just said, "I know you are there." "I suspected," he said. She turned and faced him. In the medical suite's clean light, he looked more human somehow than he did in the sanctum or the library, or perhaps that was just her reading him differently now. "Are you going to try to convince me to stay?" she asked. "No," he said. She blinked. "I am going to ask you to stay," he said, and the distinction in his voice was absolute. "I do not try to compel people I respect, and I respect you more than I have respected anyone in a very long time." "Constantin," she said, and his name felt strange and right in her mouth at the same time. "I have a clinic, I know," he said. "I am not asking you to leave it. I am asking whether there is any version of what happens next in which you are not entirely on the other side of a city from me." Elise looked at him for a long time. She thought about the roof and the stars, and the conversation that had not ended when they finally came back inside, but had simply changed shape, moving into the library, and then the dining room, and then the kitchen, where Tierdan had appeared at midnight to make tea for her with the matter-of-fact efficiency of someone who had decided she was worth the effort, and had continued until 3 in the morning, when she had finally fallen asleep in an armchair with a book in her lap and woken to find a blanket over her that had not been there before. She thought about the way he had placed himself between her and Morrivan's blade without hesitation or calculation, not as a tactical decision, but as an absolute one. She thought about the word forbidden, and how it had been attached to her presence in this court from the moment she arrived, and how he had dissolved it, not by ignoring the law, but by knowing the law better than anyone who wanted to use it against her. She thought about the fact that he was immortal, and she was not, and that somewhere in the future there was a problem there that they had not discussed, and that the sheer weight of that gap was real and not dismissible. She said, "I think we should talk about the immortality question." He met her eyes steadily. "Yes, we should. It is a significant practical complication," she said. "I am going to age, you are not. At some point, the imbalance between us becomes an acute problem." "I know," he said. "There are blood court provisions for this, are there not?" she said, because she had in fact read the Charter, and she had in fact noticed Section 19, which addressed the formal procedures available to a lord who wished to extend the same immortality to a human individual that existed among the vampire court. "There are," he said, and his voice was very careful now, very precise, because this was not a light topic. "It is not a decision I would ever make on your behalf, or present as an expectation, or use as leverage. It is a choice that would be entirely yours if you wish to discuss it, at a time of your choosing, with full knowledge of what it means." "I know what it means," she said. "I am a healer, I understand the physiology. And the rest of it? The court, the blood law, the centuries, the things that come with living in this world instead of alongside it." "I have been living alongside it for 4 years," she said. "I think I have a reasonable understanding of what it entails." She paused. "I am not saying yes to that conversation right now. I am saying that I am aware it exists, and that it does not frighten me, and that I am not going to make the decision to keep my distance from you, based on a complication I am willing to address when the time comes." Something in his expression broke open the way it had on the roof, that quality of a door in a solid wall. "Then what are you saying?" he asked quietly. "I am saying," she said, "that you asked whether there is a version of what happens next where I am not entirely on the other side of a city from you, and the answer is yes, there is such a version." He crossed the room. He did it slowly, with that particular deliberateness she had come to recognize as him choosing to be unhurried because it was a choice rather than a physical constraint. And he stopped when they were close, very close, close enough that she could see every detail of his face and the specific shade of his extraordinary golden eyes. "You are not frightened of me," he said. "No," she said. "Should I be?" "Most people are. Most people have not spent 3 analyzing your poisoning chemistry," she said. "Once you have held someone's life in your hands, the dynamic shifts considerably." He reached out and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, with a care so precise it seemed almost medical, as though he were handling something irreplaceable. His fingers were cool against her skin, and she did not flinch, and she watched something warm move through his expression at that. "I have been alive for 340 years, he said. "I have met extraordinary people in that time, rulers, scholars, artists, warriors. I have respected many of them. I have cared for fewer than I can count on one hand." He paused. "And I have not felt what I feel when you are in a room, in longer than I can accurately remember." Elise took a breath. That is a remarkable admission from someone whose immortal pride is apparently legendary. "You have been talking to Lucavian," she said. "Theodan, actually. Lucavian communicates primarily in meaningful silences." His full smile appeared, warm and genuine, and she let herself stand in it without deflection. "Elise," he said, and her name in his voice had that same different weight it had carried on the roof. "Yes," she said before he could finish whatever he was going to say. He looked at her. "You do not know what I was going to ask." "I have a reasonable hypothesis," she said. He kissed her with the same quality of careful deliberateness he brought to everything, and it was nothing like what she might have expected, and entirely like what she had been not thinking about for 3 days. His hand was in her hair, and hers found the lapel of his jacket and held on, and the cold of him was strange for only a moment, before it simply became part of the specific temperature of him, particular and his and hers to know. When they separated, she looked up at him and felt the particular clarity that comes after a decision that has been the right one, the absence of the internal friction she had not quite noticed she was carrying. "I will move the clinic," she said. "Not close it, move it. There is a building on the eastern edge of the threshold that has been empty for 2 years. It would work better than my current space, and it would be closer. "I will have Theodan look into the building," he said. "I have already identified the owner," she said. "I will negotiate the lease myself." His expression held something that might have been amusement and something that was definitively admiration. "Of course you will. You can help with the renovation funding if you insist on honoring the debt," she said. "Medical equipment is expensive. Consider it done," he said, and the warmth in his voice had no performance in it. Just the simple truth of someone who has found something they intend to keep and is unreservedly happy about it. There was still work to do in the weeks and months that followed. There always was. The blood court restructuring after Morrivan's removal was complex and occasionally tense, and Elise found herself drawn into the periphery of it more than she had expected, not as a political figure, but as a practical one, as the person who understood both the human world and the blood court world and could translate between them in moments when the gap mattered. Lucavian, she discovered, was not as silent as she had initially assumed. He was simply economical. Once he had decided she was trustworthy, which she understood had happened at approximately the moment she had looked Morrivan in the eye and refused to flinch, he spoke to her with the directness of someone who had been having insufficiently direct conversations for 2 centuries and found the change refreshing. It was Lucavian who told her, in one of those late-night conversations in the manor's kitchen that had become a sort of informal institution, that Constantin had spoken of her before she arrived, not in anticipation of her specifically, but that Theodan had mentioned the human healer at the clinic on the threshold more than once, and that Constantin had listened with an attention that had been, Lucavian said, with his characteristic precision, notable. Theodan, when she raised this with him, turned a color she had not thought vampires could turn. He was interested, Theodan said, with the dignity of someone accepting an embarrassing truth. In the clinic, in the work. I may have described you in some detail over the past 2 years because I thought it was relevant to the court's interest in the threshold. That is all. Theodan, Elise said with great fondness, you are a catastrophically transparent person. I am a loyal servant, he said, with tremendous wounded dignity, and she laughed, and he looked secretly pleased. The new clinic opened 6 weeks after the tribunal concluded. It was bigger than the old one, with a proper surgical suite and a waiting area that could hold twice as many patients in a separate consultation room that did not also have to serve as a break room and storage space. The renovation had been completed in under a month, which had involved a degree of financial and logistical support from the Gravesend court that Elise had allowed only because she had negotiated it as a formal service agreement with specified deliverables and a payment schedule, because she was not going to have her clinic be a gift dependent on any individual's continued goodwill, not even his. He had found this deeply charming and told her so. She had told him it was professional practice and not charming at all. He had kissed her in the empty surgery and said, both things are true, and she had conceded the point. Her patients returned, all of them. The human ones came back with the regularity of people who had discovered a doctor they trusted and had no intention of changing. The vampire ones came back with the particular quality of returning to something they had been uncertain about losing. Some of them making appointments for things that were not quite emergencies, things they had endured for decades or longer because they had not had a practitioner they trusted, things that could finally be addressed. Elise treated all of them. She was good at her work. She had always been good at her work, but she was better now, partly because she had better equipment and more space, and partly because she had 2 years of accumulated blood court medical archive access that had filled in significant gaps in her understanding of vampire physiology. Constantin came to the clinic sometimes and sat in the waiting room, which caused a particular quality of extremely respectful silence among whoever else happened to be there, and waited for her to finish her last appointment. And then they went to dinner, or back to the manor, or took walks in the parts of the city that were empty enough at that hour for him to be comfortable moving without drawing attention. She learned him over those months, learned the way he thought, which was in long chains of careful inference that sometimes surprised her with their conclusions, but were always internally consistent. Learned the way he spoke about history, which was as a participant rather than an observer, because most of what she had been taught as history he had watched happen in real time, and the texture of his memory for those events was something she found endlessly compelling. Learned the way he was with the people in his household, the quiet, particular attentiveness he gave Théodan's somewhat chaotic enthusiasm, the deep respect that characterized his interactions with Lucavian, the way he had noticed which of the court members were struggling in the restructuring and had taken individual steps to address it that he did not announce. He was a good man. She had suspected it from the beginning, had seen it in the evidence of how his household worked, in the design of the medical suite that someone had stocked out of planning rather than emergency, in the way Théodan talked about him with the loyalty of someone who had never been given reason to regret it. Evidence was evidence. She told him this, one evening in the library, which had become their default room for the late-night conversations that happened after the court business and the clinic were both concluded, and the rest of the manor had gone quiet. "You have been doing forensic analysis on my character," he said. He was sitting across from her in one of the deep armchairs, a book on the arm and a glass of something that was not wine in his hand, and he looked entirely comfortable in the way only people who are genuinely at home look comfortable. "I do forensic analysis on everything," she said. "It is a professional habit. And what is your conclusion?" "That you are somewhat less terrifying than your court reputation suggests," she said, "and considerably more decent than you let on in formal settings." "The court requires a particular presentation," he said. "The Lord of the Eastern Blood Court is not a role that benefits from visible warmth." "No," she agreed. "But I am not interested in the Lord of the Eastern Blood Court. I am interested in Constantin, who feeds stray cats when he thinks nobody is watching." The silence that followed was mortified. "There is one cat," he said, with great dignity. "It comes to the East Garden. I provide it with appropriate nutrition, because it would be impractical to allow it to hunt in the manor grounds." "Her name is apparently Theodora," Elise said. "Théodan told me." "Théodan," Constantin said, in the tone of a man who was going to have a very specific conversation with his assistant later, "is in possession of too much information." "He loves you," Elise said simply. "So he pays attention." Constantin looked at her across the library, and the lamplight made his golden eyes very warm, and the expression on his face had that quality she had been trying to name for months. The specific quality of the way he looked at her that was different from how he looked at everything else. "As do I," he said, and he said it the same way he said everything important, quietly, directly, with no performance and no uncertainty, as though it were simply a fact he was stating because it was true. Elise felt the warmth of it move through her completely. "I love you," she said, because she was not going to be indirect about it when he had not been. "I love you, and I find the immortality question less frightening every day that passes, and I want to be very clear that that is not a subtle reference to Section 19. It is a direct statement of a fact I have arrived at through evidence." He set down his glass and stood, and crossed to her chair and held out his hand, and she took it and stood, and he held her face in both his hands with that particular careful precision, and looked at her as though she were something he had not expected the world to contain. "We have time," he said. "There is no urgency. I only want to know that you intend to stay." "I intend to stay," she said. He kissed her with all the accumulated months of it. All the rooftops and the libraries and the kitchens at midnight and the medical suite in the very beginning when neither of them had known what was coming. And she put her hands in his silver-white hair and kissed him back with everything she had. In the months that became a year and the year that became more, the blood court found its new shape. The tribunal was restructured with a rotating membership rather than permanent appointments, a reform that Lucavian had advocated for decades, and that Constantin, with the particular practical decisiveness that characterized his best leadership, pushed through in the immediate aftermath of Moravon's removal when the political will existed to do it. It was not the only reform. Several of the blood law provisions that had been used as tools of control against people in the threshold were formally revised, a process that involved more negotiation and more tense late-night working sessions than anything else in that period, but that resulted in a legal framework that was genuinely fairer, and that would make Elise's work considerably less legally precarious for any human healer who followed her. She had not expected to become an advocate, exactly. She was still primarily a healer, and her clinic was still the center of her professional life, and she maintained that center with a clear prioritization, because she had learned early that people who lose their professional identity in a romantic relationship often regret it. But she had a voice in the court now, and a standing, and a relationship with its lord that everyone understood, even if it had not been formally declared, and she used that position when it was relevant and useful, and stayed in her own lane when it was not. It was Lucavian who raised the Section 19 question with her directly, one afternoon when Constantin was in a meeting with the tributary houses, and she was in the library reading. "It is not a thing to be hurried," Lucavian said, sitting in the chair across from her with the same settled quality he brought to every conversation. "But it is a thing to be considered. Constantin would not raise it himself, because he does not want you to feel any pressure in the direction he clearly prefers. But, as someone who has watched him for 200 years and knows what the alternative costs him, I am going to mention that the question is present, and that when you are ready to address it, he is ready to answer any question you have." She had already been thinking about it. She had been thinking about it for a while. "It is not the immortality itself that I am uncertain about," she said, because Lucavian deserved directness in return for his. "It is the clinic. My patients, particularly the human ones, have a relationship with me that is built partly on my humanity. Some of them come to me because I am not a vampire, because they feel safer with someone who shares their experience. If that changes, I need to know that the care I provide them does not change with it, that the thing that makes the clinic work survives the transition." Lucavian considered this for a moment. "That is a question about your purpose, not your fear," he said. "Which tells me you have already made the decision." She thought about it. "Yes," she said. "I think I have." "Then tell him," Lucavian said. "Simply. He will prefer to hear it from you." She told him that evening in the East Garden, which had become a place she associated with the best of conversations, possibly because of its resident cat, who appeared on cue within 3 minutes and wound around their feet with the shameless opportunism of animals who know they are loved. "I have been thinking about Section 19, she said. Constantin, who had been looking at Theodora with an expression of supreme dignity that he was maintaining over clear affection, looked up. "I am not asking you to make a decision based on. I have made the decision," she said. "I want to, on the condition that we talk through what it means for my patients and my clinic, and that we find a solution that preserves what I built there." "We will find that solution," he said, without hesitation. "Whatever it requires." "You do not know what it requires yet," she said. "I know you," he said, "and I know that whatever you require to protect what you built will be reasonable and possible and worth doing. So yes, whatever it requires." She looked at him, this vampire lord with his silver-white hair and his golden eyes and his 300 years of history and his one inexplicable cat, and felt the full and clear conviction of a choice made without ambivalence. "All right," she said. "Then yes." The formal court declaration happened on a clear autumn evening, which Elise thought was probably not accidental on Constantin's part, given that he was a man who thought about ceremony and meaning, and the resonance of timing with a depth she had come to appreciate. The entire court was assembled, not in the sanctum this time, but in the East Wing's formal reception hall, which had been opened for only the second time in a decade, a room that ran the full length of the manor's upper floor and ended in floor-to-ceiling windows looking out over the city. Elise stood at the center of the room in a dress that Theodan had selected for her with tremendous enthusiasm and very good taste, a deep green that made Constantin say, when he saw her, that she looked like spring in a world that had forgotten it was possible. She had told him that was extremely dramatic. He had told her she was worthy of it. The declaration was spoken in both the old court language and in English, which was a concession to modernity that Constantin had insisted on, and that 3 members of the senior court had registered quiet objections to, and then dropped when he looked at them. The ancient vow he spoke to her was not the life debt provision, and it was not the Section 19 clause alone. It was an older thing, a personal declaration rather than a legal one. Words in a language that was not quite Latin and not quite anything she could fully identify. that Lucavian later told her was the original language of the First Blood Court, older than most human written records. He translated them for her afterward. "I choose you, I claim you, I protect you, I keep nothing from you, I ask nothing of you that you do not willingly give. These are the words of my house which I offer you as a home." She had not expected to cry. She was not generally a person who cried easily, but she was also not generally a person who was addressed in a language older than history by a man she loved with her entire, honest heart, so she gave herself permission. His thumb caught the tear at her cheekbone, and he looked at her with that open expression, the one that had nothing of the Lord of the Eastern Blood Court in it, and everything of Constantin. And he said, quietly, against her temple, "This is not a bad thing." "No," she said, "it really is not." The court that had once declared her an outsider stood witness as the Lord of the Eastern Blood Court made her his formally, legally, and by ancient vow, and whatever they thought of it privately, they were silent. Because the law was clear, and the evidence of the last year was undeniable, and because Elise Winterbourne had walked into the center of their world with a medical bag and a forensic mind and a complete refusal to be frightened of them, and had made it better, and the best of them knew it. Lucavian, when she crossed the room to him afterward, while Constantin was being appropriately formal with the tributary houses, took her hand and bowed over it with a gravity that she was almost certain contained warmth. "Welcome," he said, "to the Blood Court. Formally and officially." "Took long enough," she said, and he actually smiled. Theoden, who had been standing 3 feet away vibrating with poorly contained emotion for the past 40 minutes, immediately pulled her into a hug that she returned fully because 4 years in the threshold and 12 months in this court had made him one of her closest friends, and she was not going to be formal about it. The city spread below the manor windows, the threshold and everything beyond it, and in the east garden a cat named Theodora was probably doing something inconvenient, and the Blood Court's new shape was still settling into itself with all the adjustments and growing pains that any real change requires. And there was work to do tomorrow, in the clinic and in the court. And Elise knew both of those truths without anxiety. She found Constantin at the edge of the room, near the windows, watching the city with the expression she recognized from the roof, the one that found something larger in the view. She stood beside him, and his arm came around her without his looking at her. The easy certainty of someone who knows exactly where someone they love is standing. And she leaned into him and looked out at the lights below. 340 years, she said, and you say you have not felt this way in longer than you can remember. That is accurate, he said. I am going to need significantly more than 1 lifetime to make a dent in that gap, she said. He pressed his mouth to her hair. We have time, he said, and the words carried the same weight they had in the library, but different now, fuller, because the question attached to them had been answered. Yes, she said. We do, outside. The city went on with its ordinary, extraordinary life, 2 worlds sharing a seam of streets and old brick, and the threshold clinic had a light on in its upper window, where Elise had left a lamp burning against her return, and the Blood Court that had once called her an outsider had learned, in the particular way that institutions learn things, that it had been wrong. She was not an outsider. She had never truly been one. She had been the person this world had been waiting for, without knowing what it was waiting for, and she had walked through its doors with a medical bag and an unfrightened heart and saved the life that mattered most, and in doing so had built something that would last as long as they did. Which, as it turned out, was going to be a very long time indeed.